So what is reflexivity in psychology? Here, Graham Richards talks about that in orthodox sciences, like for example in geology, you could say we look at rocks, we look at the Earth's mantle, we look at volcanoes, whatever. In biology, we study DNA, we study flat-headed worms, we study something, right? If you ever meet a biologist or a botanist, they're an expert in something usually. Psychology is not like other hard sciences often in that respect. Psychology is, here Graham Richards says, when you study psychology, you study the history of what the discipline purports to be studying. So what does psychology itself call psychology? There are 50-something divisions of the American Psychological Association today, all of which are filled with people who are psychologists. All of them have degrees in psychology. Majority of them have graduate degrees in psychology. Most of them have PhDs in psychology. So you have this organization called the American Psychological Association. They have a building in Washington, D.C. They spend a lot of money on advocacy. They represent the profession of psychology. You also have the American Psychological Society, which is more science-oriented, more into kind of the hard science aspect of psychology. But even there, you have many divisions. You have the American Counseling Association. Okay? You have all kinds of associations that represent psychologists. But in the American Psychological Association, you have like 50-something divisions, and then you have subgroups and other organizations that are below those divisions. And then within those divisions, you have other divisions and working groups. So you have divisions like international psychology. You have Division 52, is that? You have something like, I think you have a division that studies teaching of psychology, Division 2, general psychology, Division 1. Right? You have the division for peace psychology, division for community psychology, a division that's kind of oriented towards social justice, one that's very statistical, one that's devoted to psychoanalysis, mostly to psychoanalysis. So it's really interesting, isn't it? You have one psychologist that's studying consumer behavior, another psychologist that's studying military behavior, another psychologist that's studying forensics or courtroom-related stuff, another psychologist that's working in a clinic or a lab, another psychologist that only does academic research. You have somebody working at the United Nations bringing psychology there. You have people working in organizations. So you have psychologists doing in a lot of different areas, and then reflecting on what they do. This is reflexivity. And then in the process of reflecting on what they do, defining what they do. Do you see that? Psychology is like a shifting target depending on what psychologists are doing. The definition of psychology is a shifting definition depending on what psychologists are actively doing at that time. So psychology has this very, very large applied wing. There are many, many applied psychologists. This is not necessarily like biology, where you study certain things in a lab. You can do that in psychology. There are psychology labs, but you can also do other kinds of work in psychology, and you can still call it psychology. Who's going to say that it's not psychology, right? Peace psychology. Why not? Transgender psychology, right? African American psychology, right? The psychology of racism, the psychology of terrorism, the psychology of consumer behavior, the psychology of marketing, the psychology of purchasing, being a consumer. All of that is psychology, and that is defined as psychology depending on how psychology defines it. So here, Graham Richards says that whereas orthodox science, there is always some object of inquiry, like rocks, electrons, DNA, and stars, existing essentially unchanging in the non-human world, this is not so for psychology. The subject of anatomy, as far as I know, and physiology, has not extended too much far beyond anatomy and physiology. The social sciences are not the same as the hard sciences, but psychology does have part of it that's kind of a hard science, part of it that's not a hard science. But this is called reflexivity. And this is why we have in the psychology department, by the way, this is why psychology is the biggest major in U.S. undergrads. Among American undergrads, psychology is the most important, the largest major, because it's everything and nothing. But you learn a lot. And this is also why we have classes from everything in the psychology department, from mental health to consumer behavior to how to the specific biology, anatomy, and physiology of the brain that might be covered in a deeper level than in biology classes. All of this is in the psychology department because we are a reflexive science, because we're always growing, we're always changing. And look at the psychology faculty, not only here, but everywhere. Many are really engaged in a lot of interesting things. You have a lot of psychology faculty who do work at, like I work at companies, I work with marketing and advertising. You have other psychologists to do that, some who work in hospitals. You have some here who work with very creative projects, who work with brain scanning. You have people involved in really, really meditation, really interesting work in psychology. And I think psychology tends to attract people who are more reflexive just by its nature because of this. And this is also why psychology has been applied to organizations, industry, etc. It's the reflexive nature of psychology. You will have to know about that for the test. That, what does it mean by psychology as a reflexive science?